You're listening to the Knowledge Archives podcast. Welcome to the Knowledge Archives podcast. We're a group of students on a mission to learn from as many different disciplines of knowledge as possible. I'm your host, Madhav Malhotra, and today I'm pleased to be joined by Dr. Tanya Latty, an invertebrate biologist from the University of Sydney in Australia. Dr. Latty has many research interests, including studying non-human intelligence in swarm behavior and even microorganisms. I'm really excited to learn more from her about this amazing world of smart creatures solving problems. So thank you for joining me today. I'm really excited to learn a little bit more about your work, but could we quickly start off by having you introduce yourself?
My name is Dr. Tanya Latty. I'm an associate professor at the University of Sydney in Australia in the School of Life and Environmental Sciences. I did my PhD on bark beetles, which are these tiny little beetles that lived throughout Western North America. And they have this interesting habit of forming these large groups. And it's the fact that they can form groups that allows them to be as destructive as they are, because they can cooperate essentially to kill trees and make host out of something that would normally repel them. And so doing the work got me really interested in understanding how groups of animals in general work, because particularly for things like insects, which have teeny tiny little brains, one of the ways that you can accomplish more is to work as a big group. And so that led to work on swarm intelligence, which again is this idea that small-brained creatures working together can accomplish problem solving and even cognitive tasks that normally the individuals on their own couldn't do. And so I spent quite a bit of time working on things like ants and bees. And then just sort of almost as a fluke, I ended up studying slime molds, which are like the next level as far as swarm intelligence goes, because not only do they don't just have tiny brains, they have no brain at all, because they're single-celled organisms. Slime mold is essentially just a gigantic amoeba. And despite the fact that it has no brain, we know now that slime molds can do all sorts of very complicated things, like solving mazes and making really clever decisions about which foods to eat, and when to go out and when to stay in. And so a lot of my work kind of falls in that area. More recently, my lab group in general has started to work a lot on things like agricultural pollination systems. So trying to understand how we make pollination in farms more sustainable, both for the farmers in terms of producing more, but also on the end of conserving pollinators. And we work a lot in urban ecology. So again, trying to make our cities more friendly places for insect pollinators particularly, but also just insects in general. So I'd say my work kind of goes across a couple of disciplines. We also include lots of input from people like computer scientists, mathematicians, and civil engineers. That's more on the swarm intelligence side of things, where we're trying to see whether we can learn anything from nature about how to build better human systems. So yeah, I mean, part of my problem is that I'm interested in just about everything. Like I've never met an invertebrate I didn't like. And so, we've even started studying velvet worms more recently. So it's all over the map, but it's fun. It's one of the great pleasures of my job that I can explore the things I think are interesting and the things that I think are important.
Yeah, it sounds really cool to hear about all of those different areas. But what piqued my interest was the research into swarm intelligence. And I know I was recently telling you about, this idea with how there are cognitive capabilities that even non-human creatures have. You mentioned everything from social insects to slime molds, like these microscopic organisms. It's been gaining like a little bit more media attention, let's say, gradually, which I think is very cool. Outside of the academic world, it's great to see these ideas spill over. But if you could like summarize it, what do you think makes these creatures so different from humans in terms of how they exhibit intelligence? And what do we look for when we think about categorizing them into, well, how sentient they are?
Yeah, well, those are two really big questions. I guess on the first one, so I was trained as an animal behavior sort of ecologist background, and I think we have a tendency to focus on organisms that have brains. And I mean, that makes sense, right? I mean, if you think about what a brain actually is, it's this amazing evolutionary adaptation that gives you an organ that's specialized for processing information, for collecting information for lots of sources and mushing it together. I mean, it's an incredible system. And so it kind of makes sense, I think, that we started studying those ideas and have this really brain biased way of looking at the world. But if you take a step back, I mean, 97 to 98% of life on this planet is brainless. So think about things like fungi and plants and microorganisms. All of those creatures live in an environment that's just as complicated as the world we live in. They still have to find food or resources. In some cases, they need to find mates. If you're a slime mold, you have up to 700 potential mating types, which makes dating like super complicated. So you need to have some kind of structures to process that information. The difference is that you have to do it in the absence of that centralized processing unit, a brain. As far as like how different we are from slime molds, I mean, slime molds are a total other branch kind of on the tree of life. They're in the kingdom Protista, which itself is kind of just where we throw all the single-celled organisms that don't fit in other places. They're very, very different. So I think one of the things that I've tried to do in my research is to take a step back and get away from just thinking about how does a brain work, but think about, okay, for that other brainless majority, for that 97%, how are they processing information? And then you can kind of go to the other end of the spectrum and say, okay, so we have the brainless individuals, but what about things like ants where, yeah, you have a brain, but one of the major levels of cognition that you have is actually that swarm intelligent level. So it's the colony itself that solves problems, not just the individuals. And so they're kind of very, very different in terms of the way systems have evolved to process information. But on the flip side, there's also a lot of similarities. So even though we're talking here about what seem like different systems, at the core, what you end up having is a system where an underlying agent, so some unit of the system, is able to do very simple things like voting or whatever. And as a whole, collectively, you get a decision. And that's exactly what happens in your brain, right? Like your individual neurons are not capable of, doing a podcast or, writing academic papers or picking experiments or any of that. Your individual neurons have relatively simple behaviors. And one of the things they can sort of do is vote for different options by firing or not firing. But then collectively, when you put billions of those individual neurons together, you get this brain that allows you to do all the cool things that we can do. Ants are similar and to some extent in that individuals are not necessarily particularly cognitively complex, but they have mechanisms to communicate with one another, and they have ways of, again, sort of voting for different options. In their case, usually by laying down things like pheromones, which are chemical signals. In the case of the slime mold, it gets a little bit trickier, but what we do know about slime molds is if you look at them very closely under a microscope, different regions of the slime mold pulse at different rates. And we know that those pulsations, they'll pulse more if they're on something they like a really good food source, and they'll pump less if they're on something they don't like. We also know that each pulsing region can entrain the ones around it, which means that if you're a pulsing region next to a really quick pulsing region, you'll tend to speed up. So they have that sort of weird intercellular communication within the single cell. And so we think that it's that combination of things where they pulse more, which causes more goo, if you will, to flow in that area, which means there's more stuff pulsing, which causes more flow. We think that's the basis of most of their problem-solving abilities. And conceptually, again, that's not that different from what a brain does or what a colony of ants do. So I guess on one side, all these systems are very, very different, but I think we're starting to see the more we study them that there are some commonalities that kind of underlie all those different systems, which I think is really, really fascinating that there's lots of different ways to process information, but maybe we're all running a very similar program at the core. I think your second question was how we classify these things and whether we consider them sentient. And wow, I don't even know where to start with that question. It's so hard. I mean, I'm a scientist, so I like to classify things. I think it's extremely difficult to classify intelligence or cognitive ability or sentience. And it's hard because we don't even know what we would measure. So if you think about even humans, it's hard enough to think about what makes an intelligent human, right? What is intelligence? Is it the ability to solve math problems? Is it emotional intelligence? Is it the way we're able to communicate? I mean, there's so many different facets of human intelligence, and that's humans. We have more or less the same kind of brain. As soon as you get away from humans and start thinking about non-human animals, it just gets much harder. And then you get to slime molds and forget about it. We don't even know where to start. So I think it's something that a lot of us are thinking about all the time. Like, can we come up with a system to classify things? I don't think we're anywhere near being able to do that yet. And I suspect we might just have to get comfortable with the idea that maybe we shouldn't be classifying these things. Maybe that's just not something that makes sense in this case, because life doesn't necessarily fit into the boxes we want it to, even though that would make our lives easier.
Hmm. It's very interesting to think about, the complexity of this field that's already so evident. And in relation to like some of the points you mentioned, I think one, like it's so interesting to hear about how there are very different ways that organisms process information at different levels, from individual neurons to one individual's brain to a collective colony. But it's interesting to think about how we can compare how, say, a colony of ants might solve a problem to how a single-celled, slime mold might solve a problem to us, like how a individual human might solve a problem. And when it comes to these like comparable characteristics, there are some interesting ideas floating out there in terms of how we study these organisms. So I know you've done research on how ants can make their way through forests in different ways. When it comes to these traits that we study, could you describe some of the results that we've seen in terms of specific situations, but also in a higher level sense? These different ideas, they're all just examples of problem solving or being able to have memory.
Yep. Okay. Well, I'll give you two different types of examples. So the first set are going to be shortest path problems. So we study shortest path problems in my lab partly because they're a question that we can ask very different types of systems, which is nice because then we can look back and compare how those different systems solve the problem. So what a shortest path problem really is, or at a bigger level, it's a network building problem, is that you need to connect up certain points, and you want to find the shortest way to connect those points. So that could be finding the shortest path to a particular food item through a maze. It could be building a network that uses the minimal amount of trail or track or whatever it is. And the nice thing about that problem is that lots of different systems need to solve it. So even within your bodies, you have a vascular system that moves nutrients around your bodies through veins and arteries and capillaries. Over evolutionary time, your body essentially has had to solve that problem of what's a reasonably good way to distribute things efficiently. Ants have to solve that problem when they're going from their nest to their food sources. Slime molds have to solve that problem as they distribute themselves through the sort of goo network that they have. So we have asked that question to a bunch of different systems. In one of the things we do for ants is to use species that build trails. And what's nice about that is you can visualize trails relatively easily. And so this particular species is called the Argentine ant. It's an invasive ant in a lot of places. It's originally from South America, but you can now find it pretty much anywhere that has a Mediterranean sort of climate. Argentine ants have this nice habit of connecting up all of their nests. So a colony actually consists of a whole bunch of different nests that are all connected together to form a network. And then on top of that, they also go off to find food. So what we would do is just organize nests in different positions and then see what kind of topology, what sort of trail network the ants produced. And long story short, the Argentine ants typically will solve that as a shortest path problem. So they'll find the shortest way to connect up those paths. The networks they build are far, far, far shorter than you would expect if they were moving randomly, which is amazing. It's kind of incredible because when I give this as like a lecture, sometimes I put up a couple of problems and say, hey, can you guys figure out the shortest path between these points? And some people can get it, but a lot of us can't. So it's not a simple question. It's also even difficult for computers to solve. As you get more points, it becomes really difficult, but the ants are able to do it. What's cool is that we think we have a pretty good handle on how they manage to solve these problems. When ants move through, this particular species of ant moves through the environment, they lay little drops of a chemical pheromone, which is very attractive to them. So ants are more likely to go to places that have that pheromone than places without. And they're more likely, their probability of going in a direction increases the higher the concentration of that pheromone. And so if you imagine a whole bunch of ants just wandering around randomly, and there's maybe 3 nests they need to connect up, at first you kind of just see this cobweb of trails that go everywhere. Like there's no pattern. It's ridiculous. It's a terrible network. But over time, those trails that have just by chance connected up nests by the shortest path they get more ant passes per minute. And that's just because it's a shorter distance between those two compared to like a long meandering path that goes nowhere. That means that there's more pheromone builds up faster on that shortest path, that shortest link, which means more ants are attracted to it, which means it puts out more pheromone, which kind of causes the snowballing effect. And so over time, we can see this in our time lapses that you start with like a complicated network, but very quickly it sort of pares down and to just this very basic minimal network. And we call that a pruning process. We in fact see a very similar process when we look at how slime molds solve mazes. They initially tend to spread out everywhere, but then selectively they retract away from areas that have dead ends or loops or things, probably using a similar mechanism to the ants, until you get, again, what looks like a pretty minimal connection. So it's like two different systems that solve that problem in the same way. What's super interesting, if you kind of imagine, so I'll get you to try to visualize this. If you imagine 3 points kind of at the corners of a triangle, and then imagine you were trying to connect those up using the shortest path. The shortest possible way to connect that up is something called a Steiner tree, which is kind of like a Y. So it'd be like a Y connecting 2 of those points in the middle and a little nub in the middle, and then a straight line down to the final point, the pointy end of the triangle. That's more or less what the ants do. They do not always the shortest, but usually somewhere in that vicinity. But if you think about what that shape looks like, it's great in terms of being short, but it's terrible in terms of robustness. I mean, if you get damage anywhere on any one of those trails, one of those nests is going to be automatically disconnected. There's no resilience in that kind of a system. So now if you think, okay, let's say you want to connect 3 points together in like the most robust possible way. The way to do that would be to connect every point to every other point, right? So you'd have lots of extra trails, and that way there'd always be a backup. But the problem with that system is that it's very expensive. If you assume that building track costs you something, whether it's in time or energy or money, then having lots of extra links is a huge time or a huge cost. And so this is a trade-off where you can either have a very cheap network that is sort of the shortest path, or you can have a really robust network, but you can't actually do both at the same time. And so the slime molds and the ants seem to have, or the Argentine ants seem to have settled on doing the minimal path. But what we found more recently is that other species of ant will do different things. So the species of ant we work with in Australia, which is called an Australian meat ant, they build networks that kind of fall more in the balance point. So they're not super cheap, but they're not crazy robust. They're kind of right in that sweet spot. And we think they do that because they invest a lot more effort into building trails. So they physically clear all the vegetation from their trails. So you get this like cleared ant runway thing wherever they've built a trail. That takes a huge amount of energy to construct, but it also means that if that trail gets interrupted in some way, it's a lot of energy to fix while you try to find an alternate path. And so we suspect that because of that, they've kind of evolved this solution that finds more the balance point, that kind of has some inherent robustness. So that's sort of an example of where you can take one type of problem and look at how a whole bunch of different systems solve it. And that gives us, I guess, insight into not only how nature kind of shapes, how the ecology of a system shapes the systems they evolve, but it also tells us how there are different ways to solve that problem.
Mm-hmm. It's very interesting, when you give the lectures in universities, sometimes it's hard for even humans to solve it. And on larger scales, it's hard for computers even to solve it. And on that note, exactly what you ended off with, there are some values that we can gain from solving these hard optimization problems for reapplying these kinds of ideas for human purposes. So I'd love to ask you about, have we seen some of the developments take place from translating these ideas from observations in biology to actual applications?
Yeah, I mean, that's the dream, right? I mean, we hope ultimately that some of what we learn can be applied. There is an example of something called an ant colony optimization algorithm that was developed back in the 90s. And that was based on sort of the simplified behavior of a general ant. And it works pretty well for solving optimization problems. But I think one of the challenges with bio-inspired computing and algorithms and such is that there's just so many different living things. So that original ant colony optimization algorithm is really a generalization of what ants do. And in fact, ants don't themselves use that algorithm. It's kind of a very modified version. I think one of the strengths and one of the future directions of bioinspiration is to kind of start looking across a whole bunch of different systems in more detail so that we get more information about how very different systems work to solve problems. There's a lot of interest, I think, in this space, particularly when it comes to things like space exploration or search and rescue, agriculture, places where there's a big risk. So sort of places that we want to automate things. So we're starting to think about using robots, for example, to help with agriculture, or robots to explore, Mars or whatever. The problem is if you put a lot of money into building one really awesome robot, and then that robot gets hit by a landslide or stepped on by a cow or whatever, you've kind of lost all that money. And so the other way to look at it would be, okay, well, maybe instead of having one expensive robot that can do all this processing, maybe it makes more sense to have lots of individual robots, like a swarm of robots. And that swarm, it will be resilient to the loss of any particular individual because as a group, it can still solve its core mission. Because who does swarm intelligence better than systems that have been evolving to do that for millions of years? I think the other place where bioinspiration can really improve things is when we think about human infrastructure networks. So infrastructure systems like, the telecommunication network that's allowing us to talk to each other, from opposite ends of the planet. These things are amazing and awesome, and they make our lives better in lots of ways, but they're also becoming a lot more complicated than I think we're all accustomed to. I mean, if you look at, maps of the internet, these things are crazy complicated. And to a large extent, they're no longer a centralized thing. They're decentralized. There is no central command station. I think for humans to kind of start thinking about how we make sure that those systems are stable and how we make sure that they are resilient, it makes a lot of sense, again, to look at organisms that have been running these kinds of massively decentralized systems and have had millions of years to optimize to an extent that they are resilient. They don't have error cascades and things that we are already starting to see in some of our massively decentralized human systems. So I think there's a lot that we can learn from the social insects in that way. I think the other place that it's kind of a less obvious one, applying some of what the basic things about we learn. So for example, misinformation we know is a big problem right now. Error cascades where somebody will tweet something and then everybody retweets it, and all of a sudden we have this huge cascade of misinformation. One of the things my lab group is studying now is how social insects deal with those types of cascades. And what we're finding is that those systems have ways of being able to prevent misinformation from spreading. And I think by looking at lots and lots of different systems, maybe one of those is something that we can use. I should stress that when we talk about being inspired by nature, we're not actually saying we should do what nature does. Sometimes there's the misconception, like I'll have friends say things like, oh, we should all be like bees and cooperate. And like, you don't want to be like a social insect. Like a social insect society is not one that I'd want to live in. They are very killy with one another. And yeah, that's okay. They've evolved to live in a very different environment than the human society. But what I think we can do is take the bits that we can see that are useful from studying those insects and slime molds, and then apply them and change them to suit what we need. So it's not copying nature, it's really being inspired and getting ideas from nature.
I think it's so interesting to see how, I imagine at one point it must have been bizarre, the first person just going out there to observe ants and slime molds and just all these random things, but then they come back later and it's like, oh wait, we can actually take some of these ideas that we never knew about and actually repurpose them to all of these areas where it's literally at the edge of the development in these fields of computing, as you mentioned. In terms of the future, it's really interesting to think about, just like you mentioned, how we're creating these more decentralized applications in, say, computing networks. How are we going to avoid the problems that nature has already dealt with when it comes to this? And on that note, what do you think is the landscape like in terms of research on this issue when it comes to what more there is to be found when it comes to in the next 5 years? What are you most excited to see more research on?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. I think some of the things that are potentially really interesting, I think, is to start looking at a wider range of organisms. even in the swarm intelligence world, we've tended to focus on things like honeybees, which we know well, and a few species of ant. But there are millions of species of insect. We have 1 million recorded species of insect, and most people think there's between 5 and 10 million species total. There are 900 species of slime mold that have been identified, and again, that's probably a massive underestimate. Like, the world is hyper diverse, and I think it's super important to start looking at that range of species. So to go away from just saying like, oh, we studied this Argentine ant and thus all ants do this, and starting to really embrace that diversity and seeing, okay, well, Argentine ants do this one thing. What do meat ants do? What do green-headed ants do? What do all these different species do? And what does that tell us about how ecology shapes cognitive systems? I think that's a really exciting issue. And I guess as a field, though, what it's really made apparent to me, and I think it's starting to become apparent to lots of people, is that swarm intelligence, to some extent, we can't divorce that from conservation, because as many amazing species as there are, we're losing them at an incredible rate. I mean, we're almost by every estimate losing species faster than we can name them. To me, that's completely horrible and unconscionable. But it also means, just from a selfish perspective, it means that we're losing all of that information forever. It's like burning a library without knowing what the books are. Some of those species could hold huge promise for all sorts of things, and they're just going to vanish before we know that they're there. So I think at least my own research is increasingly starting to focus a bit more on conservation and trying to protect what we have left, and trying to really make that point to people that, look, it's not even just about saving the planet because I like insects. I mean, I do love insects, but it's not just about that. It's about saving ourselves. It's about saving all that promise. It's about saving our future. So I think for me, that's a direction that my research is taking. It's also starting to try to apply what we've learned about swarm intelligence and maybe taking that back now and using that for conservation. So thinking about using swarms of sensors to start getting a better idea of which pollinators are around and which ones are in trouble, or taking ideas of swarm intelligence and maybe thinking about ways to protect other social bee colonies from collapse and those sorts of things. So I think those are the areas I'm most interested in and that I'm most passionate in.
Great to wrap up on that kind of inspirational note. I think, we could talk for another hour on all of the issues when it comes to pollinators, but when it comes to this one aspect of your research, when it comes to swarm intelligence, this has been really interesting to think about some of the details of how this area of research works, and also to think about what's coming next when it comes to how this can be applied for both human and environmental purposes. So thank you for all of this insight that you've provided.
No problem. It's lovely chatting with you.
hmm If someone would be curious to learn more about the field and your work in it, where might they go?
If you're interested in finding out more about what I'm doing, I have a website, so it's just www.tanyalatty.com. Tanya Latty is a surprisingly uncommon name, so pretty easy to find on the internet. There's that. I mean, other than that, if you're just interested in entomology, there's some wonderful resources about insects around. There's a free Coursera course that's offered by the University of Alberta, and it's fantastic. I think it's called Bugs 101 or something along those lines, but it's great resources if you want to learn more about insects in general. If you want to learn more about slime molds, it's a little bit tricky. There's a great Facebook group called the Slime Mold Appreciation Group, which sounds weird, but is amazing. They've got great pictures of different slime mold species and all sorts of things along those lines. So yeah, I think those are probably the best places to start. But even, I mean, really just getting outside, I think, is probably the best way to learn about nature in general. I mean, even in a backyard, you'd be surprised how many species of ant are just kicking around, how many slime molds there are. It's just a matter of really looking.
All right, that's an amazing call to action. And it was great to hear about all of the ways that we can try to take this onto ourselves in our own lives if it comes to being more curious about this. So thank you for all of your insights and that final bit of advice.
No problem.